Caging has long been the term specifically applied to challenging voters, usually poor, usually minority, usually Democratic, by challenging their residences at the polling place. But news from New Hampshire is suggesting that the definition may need to be expanded to include broader actions by state legislatures. At least 24 Republican-controlled state houses are trying to commit voting fraud under the guise of preventing it. They just ran into a buzzsaw in Concord. That legislature's attempt to suppress voting there was shot down by New Hampshire Governor John Lynch, who has vetoed a complicated law that would have demanded various levels of photo identification, among other things, for voters. In rejecting the law, Governor Lynch said, quote, "The bill creates a real risk that New Hampshire voters will be denied their right to vote. There is no voter fraud problem in New Hampshire. A two-tiered system of photo IDs for registering and voting makes no sense." A similar bill looms in Ohio, and the corrupt Governor John Kasich could sign it this week. In a report for the PBS series Need to Know, Ohio State University law professor Daniel Tokaja underscored the shell game going on here.
If you listen to some state legislators, you'd think that voting fraud is rampant. In reality, it is not rampant. I don't think there's any question that there is a somewhat concerted effort, at least, on the part of Republican-dominated legislatures to tighten the rules for voting. And it seems to me that the purpose of this tightening of the rules is to make it more difficult for eligible voters to vote.
Some historical background here for context. Republicans often darkly murmur about voter fraud. For more than half a century, they have pushed, and still do, the historic lie that John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon in 1960 only because of voter fraud by the Democratic machine in Illinois. Many of them still believe that Nixon would have won if he'd had the 27 Illinois electoral votes they say were stolen by Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley and the Democrats via voter fraud. Give Nixon those Illinois electoral votes, and instead of Kennedy 303, Nixon 219, the total would have been Kennedy 276, Nixon 246. Kennedy still wins. A pleasure now to welcome Heather McGhee, the Washington Director for the Nonpartisan Public Policy Research and Advocacy Organization, DEMOS. And we are honored to say Countdown contributor. Heather, good evening. Good to talk to you.
Keith, we missed you.
Thank you kindly. Give me a quick education, because I didn't do this while I was out, on how demanding various forms of ID specifically targets minority voters, poor voters, and frankly, left of center voters.
Absolutely. So nationwide, we saw in this year, honestly, a carpet bombing across the states of these kind of voter suppression bills. So voter ID, for example, it may sound common sense, right? You have to use a photo ID to do a lot of different things in this country, but exercising your constitutional right to vote should not be one of them. If you look at the numbers of who's disproportionately affected because they don't have the passport, birth certificate, social security card it requires to go to the DMV and get a driver's license, 1 out of every 3 18-year-olds across the country doesn't have a driver's license. 1 out of every 4 African Americans doesn't have a state ID. 1 out of every 5 young voters, low-income voters, and even 1 out of every 6 senior citizens doesn't have this kind of ID. Obviously, what do all those people have in common is that they are part of the surging American electorate. They tend to vote Democratic. But this really doesn't have to be a Republican-Democratic issue. Why is it that we continue to allow these attacks on our democracy sort of from all over the place?
Well, I guess that leads into the other question, which it seems to be pretty evident that Republicans are much better at pushing these bills and drumming up these sort of false flags about voter fraud than Democrats are against defending against them. Is there anything to do about that? Is that the essence of the issue right now?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, I wasn't in the Republican war room that looked at the demographic numbers coming out of 2008. But if I were, I would have said, you know what? This spells, you know, the writing on the wall here is that we are going to be a permanent minority. So if there were a bill that could in one fell swoop disenfranchise the majority, you know, have a disproportionate impact on the types of people that we don't want to vote, and we could introduce it in 33 states in one fell swoop and make the Democratic activists sort of scramble around the country, I would do it. And that's exactly what they did. The problem is that Democrats and progressives in general really haven't said, you know what, this is part of a broader attack on our democracy. Look at what's happening with campaign finance reform, with the Supreme Court taking the teeth out of public financing just yesterday. Obviously, Citizens United, the court saying that our politics isn't corrupt enough and corporate executives and lobbyists should be able to spend whatever they want. If you look at all of these issues, and as well the attack on unions, which is the only way for regular working class people to band together and have a little clout in their state house or in Washington, all those different trends are really pointing to the type of democracy that most Americans wouldn't recognize, and Democrats haven't really made that a rallying cry.
Is there something overarching in terms of voting reform that could be done to sort of preempt this attempt to throw an obstacle course in front of every minority or poor voter?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we need a full package of democracy reforms. We could do at the federal level, we could require same-day registration. I mean, why do we need to have all of these onerous regulations, right? Republicans love to talk about onerous regulations around voting. In the states where there's same-day registration, there's much higher turnout among the people who are less likely to vote without same-day registration. We could have an omnibus bill. There are bills in the Congress to have public financing of our campaigns so that people aren't as disgusted with our politics, to get rid of felony disenfranchisement laws. I mean, if we had the public will to really say that democracy in America is important and that we should be leading the world in civic participation, there are plenty of solutions.
Countdown contributor Heather McGhee of Demos in Washington, it's a pleasure to be working with you officially. Great, thanks for that.
Thanks, Keith.
So, what did Goldman Sachs do with that $10 billion of bailout money we gave them? Created 1,000 new jobs. Not in this country. Worst's next.